non-profit dedicated to working closely with governments to ensure high-quality education in government schools, empowering every child to reach their full potential. So I'm going to hand you over to Kruti. Kruti will have the fireside chat with Kailash. So over the dais is yours. Please.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. So Gayatri reached out to me last week, and there are a couple of my team members here. If you know me, you know that I really dislike public speaking. So that's one, right? And then Gayatri reached out to me and said, hey, we'd like you to moderate this fireside chat. And I said, okay, what's the topic? And she said, technology and AI impact and scale. And reluctantly I said, well, I'm not sure I'm an expert on technology and I have limited knowledge. So she said, no, just wing it. You'll be fine. And then I got to know that Kailash was the person that I would be speaking with, and I checked out a number of your videos just to get a sense of who you are and how you think about the world. And I saw one of your speeches at IIT Bombay, where he started talking about how things in the world are random and the butterfly effect, and that immediately resonated. So I said, well, if I lose him in the conversation, at least we have a plan B backup where we can talk about the world and the universe and many other things that fascinate me as well. So thank you for joining us, Kailash.
Thank you, Kruti. It was IIIT Bangalore.
Okay. Bangalore, okay. So yeah, I think you flew in this morning or this afternoon, and it's the Chacha has been an amazing convening, I think, for the last couple of days. Is this your first time at Chacha?
Yes.
And it's how do you feel about kind of the potential for a convening like this to kind of galvanize or mobilize social impact and entrepreneurs and leaders in the sector to come together and think about many issues that are relevant, complex social problems that are challenges for us today?
I think such convenings are absolutely powerful, and convenings are, we spoke about the butterfly effect earlier, yeah. So if you understand it, if you abide by it, and if you look at the world through the lens of the butterfly effect, convenings are generally what really catalyze big changes through history. Good change, bad change, that's besides the point, but it always is a convening. Could be with 2 people, could be with 10 people. So when you have a convening which is thematic, which is focused, and you bring brilliant people, when you have rational discourse, ideas, even the ones that are out there, I think there's a high probability that the outcome is also going to be positive. So yeah, the fact that I'm here midweek and I left home, Bangalore, I've flown in from Bangalore at 8 a.m. and I've just walked in here. So it's been a very horrid day for me travel-wise. But the fact that I'm here, I was deeply interested to figure out what was going on, and I figured the Charcha is a great convening, so that's why I'm here.
I know the Dutch team is super delighted and happy that you're here, and I'm also glad that we're able to meet and get to know each other and have this conversation.
Thank you.
I guess one of the things that I just wanted to ask you about, just given your worldview and how your own journey in technology, but also just your own journey in life, as you've thought about the world and how there are challenges in the world right now. I think one of the things that I reflect on is that many complex social issues are fundamentally human challenges and behavioral challenges. And I've grappled with the issue of what does the use of technology look like? How do we think about technology when we're grappling with complex social issues? How do we look at that as social entrepreneurs that are looking to make the world a better place? So I guess I'd love to understand what your thinking is on that. I mean, what from your standpoint, and having kind of built the technology backbone of Zerodha and many other things that you've done in your life, what is your perception of the role of technology, given many of the social issues and problems that we are facing today?
My views generally around technology and my love for technology, they've evolved significantly over the last 2 decades. And just to set some context, I started coding, tinkering when I was in my early teens, perhaps when I was about 13 years old. So I've been doing it for a long time as a hobby. So it's been my mental foundation, tinkering, writing software, building things, breaking things. So I identify strongly as a tinkerer, as a technologist. So for the longest time, I had a tech-first worldview. I could immediately see software solutions to many problems or any problems that I saw around me. Software solutions or technology solutions for social problems. But over the last decade, and maybe especially over the last 5, 6+ years, when we started doing a lot of work in the social sector, in the development sector, started working with n number of organizations, I think my idealism, my techno-solutionist, hobbyist view changed significantly. And at this point in life, at this juncture, I've accepted, I've understood through experience, through interactions, through my own lens as a technologist, that most social problems do not have technology solutions. I think, especially over the last decade, since the explosion of internet-scale technologies, as we call them, where everything is an app, there's an app for absolutely everything, there's a tech solution for absolutely every inconvenience that we face in our daily lives. I think there's a lot of optimism, but generally a lot of misguided optimism and hope that technology will solve social problems. Because we've been trying to solve social problems for thousands of years. And suddenly there's this silver bullet, internet plus technology plus software plus hardware and whatnot, which has absolutely exploded all over the place, taken over, brought immense amounts of convenience. So I think I'm starting to, or I've already started to look at technology and the social/development sector, societal problems with a very, very nuanced lens. And that understanding is still evolving. But the crux of my understanding is that most social problems don't have tech solutions. And in the social sector, because there's an absolute dire lack of tech capacity, on the one hand, you have the industry which has just paced ahead. It's light years ahead in terms of technical capabilities, technical problem solving. Even the state is heavily tech capacitated now. But the social sector has really been left behind. Every non-profit that you speak to, the first question that I get asked is, where do I find an engineer? How do I find an engineer? And that's a question everybody can relate to. But there's a big element of FOMO there. And I think a nuanced, very nuanced view of technology is what the social development sector requires, because any sort of rushed, optimistic adoption in the hopes that a certain technology will solve a certain problem may turn out to be very problematic, because the sector works with the most vulnerable, the most fragile. So my views are still evolving, but that's where it is at. It's starting to become more and more nuanced.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think, I run an education non-profit, and I think that one of the big questions is, edtech, for example, is almost seen as at least a couple of years ago, was seen as a silver bullet, right? And I think our model is very much around the teacher as the agent of change and very much human-centric. And therefore, when you think about technology, you have some existential questions that get asked about, what does education need to look like in the future, 5 years, 10 years from now? And then what does that look like in classrooms? What does that look like for the ecosystem? And so what you said resonates a lot, because it leads to a lot. That is a question that I grapple with, because we can't immediately run to technology, because these are fundamentally complex social issues. But coming to, I think, what you kind of recognizing that is the case with Rain Matter Foundation, which I think is working on climate issues. How have you thought about technology when it comes to the foundation? Is it something that you've consciously, given your background and experience, is it something that you consciously tried to think about from the beginning, about how to build that into some of the work that the foundation is doing, or is it not in consideration at the moment?
Ironically, despite my being a technologist, an active one at that on a daily basis. At Rainmatter Foundation, we've set technology aside as a tool. We've taken a very nuanced view there. And climate is an all-encompassing problem. It affects absolutely everything. It's a planetary problem. Everything from food to water to soil to the biosphere, ecologies, gender, identity, livelihoods, everything is tied to climate. And to think of climate as a tech problem could be extremely dangerous. There may be tech solutions. I mean, we often hear of systems that better utilize energy or systems that capture carbon. These are all small little facets and they'll all play a role. But if we were to take that lens that climate is a problem that can be solved with a bunch of technologies, I think that's going to be extremely dangerous given the position that we are in. If we use our privilege to push through such a view, it would be dangerous. So we've had that understanding from the get-go at the Rainmatter Foundation, and we take that nuanced view. And thankfully, the tech capacity that we have, the understanding that we have, allows us to figure out what technology fits in where, or whether technology is needed there to begin with.
Okay.
So we are using technology as a tool, as a lever, and the idea is to only use it where it's absolutely necessary, where you have a solution to a certain problem, or you have a potential solution, and if technology can aid that or accelerate that, then it may be useful. And the technology could be anything. It could be something rudimentary, it could be software. So we have taken a very nuanced view at the Rainmatter Foundation. Yeah.
So for individuals and organizations here who are either social entrepreneurs or running non-profits, and of course there are also, I think, donor partners and others who are just here at Charcha because they have an interest in complex social issues and solving for those. The topic of our session is scaling impact through tech. And so the question that gets asked of a lot of social entrepreneurs or social enterprises is, yes, perhaps you can make this change happen in a particular cluster of schools, colleges, hospitals, etc., whatever your unit of change is. But then the question often is, how do you scale that? Because the size of the problem is immense. So how do you think about scale? How do you think about, how do you think about scale? And when you think about impact, what does that mean to you?
I think thinking of scale with technology at the center, especially when dealing with social problems, it's very complex. This is something I've learned the hard way as a technologist. I'd like to cite one specific example. So there's this organization called the Robin Hood Army. They're not even a registered organization. They're a loose collective of volunteers who come together, pick up food wherever there's surplus, and they go distribute meals. And they exist all across India. There are small little chapters everywhere. And there are lakhs of volunteers who do this on a daily basis. And they've been organizing this entire affair over WhatsApp groups. And they scaled the whole thing pan-India without even being registered org using WhatsApp. Now that's a great example. And they didn't really think of using a piece of technology to scale it. If on day one they thought that what they need is an app for the volunteers to download and use and organize this whole thing, I think it would have failed. Yeah. But they picked whatever was most accessible. Everybody has WhatsApp, so there's no friction for a volunteer to start using it. And then they scaled massively. But then at a certain point, they hit other walls of scale. So you have all this activity happening very organically using a very commonly, easily available piece of technology, which is WhatsApp. But then there was no visibility into what was happening. There were some volunteers who'd go and distribute 100 meals over many days and months. There were many volunteers who'd show up once, do one meal distribution, and then just disappear. So they wanted a way to tell the stories of the people who were committed. So that's where they felt the need that maybe there is a small little missing thing that can be scaled with a certain new kind of technology. So we volunteered, we worked with the organization and helped them build a really simple web page check-in tool, as we call it. So no need to download an app. So when volunteers reach a certain site and they distribute meals, they open this web page, they do a check-in, they take a photo and they enter the number of meals they distributed. And this comes with location information, Bangalore chapter or Hyderabad chapter or whatever. Then there's a web page that plots cities on a graph based on this. And suddenly, that really, really simple thing, really simple, press a button, it shows up on a web page as a graph. That changed something. Suddenly, you could see that Delhi was, for instance, delivering X meals per day, and Bangalore was here. And then the Bangalore chapter wanted to compete with Delhi. That small element of competition kicked in, which was fully invisible on WhatsApp as a medium. Then Bangalore started delivering more meals. So they'd already scaled, they were already doing well, but the impact just, I think, it went up by an order of magnitude. I can't quantify it, I don't have the numbers, I mean, they'll have it. And then the stories of people who are really truly committed, people who are going out and doing 100 meal deliveries, all of those stories started coming out. Then as a token of appreciation, once you did 50 check-ins, you would get a small little certificate with a name saying you are a meal delivery ninja and whatnot. And people started appreciating that. People started cherishing those certificates. Really, really simple, low-cost piece of technology that was built with a couple of volunteers. And the impact was great. So this was a big lesson for me personally. And we had similar experience with a few other organizations also. Really, really simple commodity tech interventions done in quick time at no cost, generating massive impact. But with all these orgs that we worked with, if they thought on day one, how do we use technology to scale the social problem we are solving, I don't think they would have even succeeded into the second year. So I'd like to think of, I call this first principles thinking really. You focus on the social problem that you're trying to solve, and you come up with a solution. It could be a very tedious offline solution, could be a point-to-point, one-on-one solution. And once you start solving it, then you think of bringing technology in very small, little first principle ways, rather than envisioning a massive technology system. Now, envisioning massive technology systems also work, but the probability of them working is low. And they only work for some people and some orgs that really have the capacity. But for most orgs, most groups of people trying to solve social problems, that small little first principles way of thinking is the way to go. So this has been a big lesson, and we've built evidence, hands-on evidence with many orgs trying this approach.
And I think what I'm hearing you saying is, don't start, with the technology as your solution at the beginning, but as you are thinking about scale and you've had proof points and you've had some success with your solution, look for opportunities where you might use technology to either expand your operations or to perhaps, have ways in which you can pick up whether or not your intervention is working in the way that you would imagine. Right?
Exactly. As an accelerant, low-cost, super quick accelerant, that will give you massive impact. For an org to think of large technology systems or solutions, they have to have immense tech capacity. They have to have technical skills, technical understanding, and experience. How many social sector orgs have that? 99% of them don't. So start small, start with first principles thinking. That works. And it's a personal project of mine to build a body of evidence with actual case studies and working examples like this and present it.
And I think it's really nice to use the word as an accelerant, because it also, that's a nice framing, because it introduces the timing of when you can look at technology and how you should perhaps look at technology, and also that a technology solution does not have to be a new app or a platform or an incredibly complicated dashboard. You can think of technology to be simple and easy, and to just make things, scale in a faster, more efficient manner.
Yeah, contrary to popular belief, many big tech success stories in the industry have been built like this. There aren't technologists sitting down and thinking of building massive systems on day one. Zerodha is a good example for this, which I can present personally as a case study. We started really small, and the pieces were built bit by bit over a decade. And we have 14 years this month, and our tech effort is, I think, 12 years old. And it's in the 7th or 8th year where all the pieces clicked in, and we suddenly saw massive growth. So even in the industry, even large tech companies are built with first principles thinking and small little building blocks.
I was actually going to ask you about the Zerodha story because I think it's exactly as you said, a case study, right? Because you thought about perhaps technology perhaps earlier on. So maybe you could share with us a little bit about the tech journey with Zerodha and exactly what you said. Maybe you could walk us through a little bit. Maybe that would have some useful learnings for other non-profits that are also looking at learning from how you've approached technology and when you made those strategic choices about when to be simple, when to maybe think about it in a bigger manner.
So Zerodha is a financial services firm. We offer technology products to end users to invest and trade in the stock markets. And Zerodha was started in 2010 as a discount broker. That's a term in the industry where you offer financial services, capital market services for a very low cost. And there was no technology roadmap. So that was 2010. And 2012-13 is when the tech journey started, by complete coincidence, butterfly effect. I was in JP Nagar in Bangalore for whatever reasons. And Nitin, who's the founder of Zerodha, he was in JP Nagar in Bangalore, and we happened to be across the road. That's how the meeting happened, and we just got along. So that's the butterfly effect. But in 2012-13, in that period, when we figured that the finance industry, there was no tech innovation happening in the finance industry, and it was a green field, and we could do a lot of things. That's really how the whole tech journey started, with that thought. The first thing that we did, that I personally did, in what was Zerodha, a small little brokerage firm with, let's say, a few dozen people who were sitting on the floor handling telephone calls, because we didn't have an app, there was no technology, and whatever technology we offered was the same stock product that the stock exchange offered to all brokers. So everybody gave the same piece of software, which was provided by the exchange. The first thing that we did was not envision how we are going to transform stock markets or how we are going to build our own cool app. In fact, we started thinking of our own app 4 years later, after starting the tech journey. The first thing that we did was digitize really tedious processes that were happening in what was a small little upcoming firm. I'd personally go sit with people who were handling phone calls, understand their workflows, and I'd figured that there were a lot of extremely tedious, laborious workflows. Somebody juggling Excel sheets manually, taking 40 minutes to do something. And this was when we were handling just 5,000 clients. We only had 5,000 users back then. Today we have 15 million users. So, as a programmer, as a tinkerer, I'd write a simple script or a program to reduce those 40 minutes of tedium to 10 seconds of automation. Oh. So it was literally built brick by brick. That's the view that we took. Unless we as an org internally digitize and build that capacity, build that understanding, unless we fix the foundation, there's no point in trying to build an app, a cool app that we'd give out to our customers. So that's how the journey started. And once you fixed a bunch of these things and automations, suddenly you became efficient and new problems arose. Then the requirement for better systems. So we built slightly larger systems and larger systems and larger systems. And at some point, I think 2-3 years into this, we figured that the product that we were offering our customers, which is exactly the same thing that every broker was offering, it wasn't great. Because we fixed the foundations bit by bit, we had the mental bandwidth and the acumen at that point to think of this, to even tackle and attack this problem. So that's when we figured that maybe we should attempt building an app ourselves, a good quality app, a modern app, and give to our users. So that's how that started. And our first app came out in 2015, 3 years later. And 2017, we built our first mobile app. In 2015, we built a web app, and smartphones for penetration was really low. So it wasn't even a priority. So we waited for the right place, right time. But this requires technical capacity and understanding. As we were slowly becoming a tech org, we had this understanding. And this also, I think what also really helped us was we had the ability to resist FOMO. Because by mid-2010s, the startup scene had absolutely exploded. There were tons of cool apps. There were investors coming in, investing in all kinds of apps. Fintech was becoming a thing. But we resisted FOMO. and built things bit by bit slowly. 2019 is when we really had our first big break. We became India's largest broker in terms of users. And when the COVID pandemic lockdown happened, so 2020 Jan, we had 2 million customers. 2021 Jan, we had 12 million customers. So it took us a decade to get to 2 million users. And this black swan anomalous event that was COVID gave us 10 million users in 1/10 of the time. These were things you couldn't foresee. But all the right technology decisions, all the right business decisions that we had taken over a decade, it just paid off. And the scale just happened. The impact just absolutely unlocked. We couldn't have predicted. If we set out in 2010, 13, etc. to build like a fancy app on day one, we would have failed miserably. So first principles is what really worked for us. And I'm not saying that this approach will work for everyone. There are many approaches. But this approach has a higher probability of working. And if not working, limiting damage. Because if you go all in without having proper capacity and understanding, the likelihood of failure is high, but the depth and impact of failure is also really high. So that's what I mean by first principles, building it brick by brick. And then one day your understanding, your capacity will also grow exponentially for you to take big tech leaps. So this is how I think of tech and scale impact, not just in the industry where we build technology, but also in any org, absolutely in the social sector also.
And I think what's interesting is that when you were talking, I think the way that you started the journey with technology was to essentially solve a problem, and
absolutely.
That's where the journey started. But then as you were talking it through, I think there was also a strong innovation layer that you mapped onto it, which is you're of course solving for a problem, but then you're also trying to see how can we make things better and how can we actually shift that entire brokerage ecosystem towards a better optimization.
Yeah.
Right? And then that innovation layer also makes things, it may lead to maybe some disruptive impact.
Absolutely. So, but you have to have that foundation first. So that's what I was saying. The first 3-4 years, we were building the foundations purely internally, solving our own problems, internal problems. That is what enabled us to even think of innovation meaningfully. Because by the time we'd gained that experience, over a period of 2-3 years, we had a clear sense of how to go about solving big problems now. Yeah. But it couldn't have happened on day one. Or we would have attempted and most likely not have succeeded.
I think maybe one of the things that happens also in the social impact sector is that because you're dealing with, fundamental, behavior, human issues, but you've also got, India is such a diverse country and so many different states have their own contexts and, rural is different from urban. And then when you're working with government, it's a very different dynamic to when you're having more control over the programs or interventions that you might run. So when you're thinking at Zerodha about the future, perhaps, I guess there's how do you plan for the future given the amount of uncertainty? Because that's something that has a clear parallel with the social sector, because you're dealing with inherent uncertainty. And in uncertainty because you don't have control over certain things. So you control what you can control, but still the default state is uncertain. And so, but then you still have to plan. And so just curious how you think about it at Zerodha, because technology is also evolving so rapidly.
I think the most important step is acceptance. Accepting that it's not just uncertain, it's chaotic. And in stock markets are the personification of chaos. Every second, something extremely volatile can happen, and you see it's literally visualized at up and down graphs, right? So accepting that reality is step one. And I think that already gets you 50% ahead. That you can't predict the future, especially in what is inherently a complex, volatile, uncertain system, like stock markets. So then, once you accept that, how you look at problems, how you build technology, how you take business decisions, they all automatically start factoring this in. Every piece of technological decision that we take factors in this volatility and uncertainty. We're picking this technology, can it handle all this chaos that might happen tomorrow? Because you can't predict tomorrow. You can't predict that in stock markets. You absolutely can't predict that in society. So it's a way of thinking. It's not a technique in technology that you apply. It's not that there is a certain kind of technology that you'll pick that is stock market volatile or society volatile ready. It's the same kind of technologies, but how you stitch them together, how you architect it is what really matters. And for that, being grounded in reality and accepting this fact is step one. And this is what applies to all problem solving. And this is what we literally call first principles thinking.
Yeah, that's great. And I guess an extension to something that you were mentioning earlier around capacity, right? Just absorptive capacity, even in a non-profit. In Zerodha, you would have, the engineers, you'd have the folks who have the background to be able to build those platforms. But as we think about scaling impacts in the social sector, and if we see technology as an enabler, like you did with Robin Hood Army, there is that reality that, technology is not the dominant skill set of a social sector org or a non-profit. Yeah. And so when you talked about, how you work with maybe different organizations to figure out and diagnose and see where you might be able to build something, how do we create that mapping, or how do we create that capacity for non-profits? Because, this is, I guess in your case with Robin Hood Army, it relies on, your time availability and the goodness of your heart, and somebody on the other side being able to absorb that. And how do we replicate that so that we can create more of that? Because then we try and have more good solutions actually reach their potential.
Oh, absolutely. This one big problem, this one big realization that it's not the lack of technology out there, it's the lack of capacity in the sector, which is the problem. It's been one of my biggest, personal projects that I've been working on since 2020-21. We, as a collective of people who realize this, as a collective of technologists, we've been trying all kinds of experiments. And the volunteering work we did with Robin Hood Army and many other orgs, these are all experiments for evidence building. So the reality is that it's not that the social sector lacks tech capacity. The reality is that it has no tech capacity. And like zero, it's literally zero. We've spoken to hundreds of orgs. I mean, Rainmatter Foundation alone works with hundreds of orgs. And we have never seen a social sector org, except a handful, single-digit handful, who have really good tech capacity. And the fundamental problem is engineers, developers, tech people, why would they come to the social sector? Only people who are very socially inclined, who have engineering skills, end up in the social sector. And that's a very small fraction. At the end of the day, there are careers. People have to get a tech job. They want to innovate and learn, so they have to be amongst their peers. They have to be in a tech company who interfaces with other tech companies and communities. No such thing exists in the social sector. So what would attract a technologist or a developer to the social sector? Why would somebody join an NGO which has no other developers? I mean, you'd just be isolated on day one, right? You need peers, you need ecosystem, you need the entire shebang to be there. It doesn't exist. And the social sector has no purchasing power capacity to match, let's say, salaries. It really comes down to this also, right? The social sector cannot match industry salaries, and that's the reality. And all big philanthropists in India who fund a large number of non-profits all admit this. You can't attract tech talent. So how do we, I mean, it's a chicken and egg problem then. How do you attract tech folks to the social sector? I think there have been no answers. There are no easy answers. So after many iterations, one big experiment that a bunch of us are trying right now is trying to, so there have been big breakthroughs in technology in general in the last 5 or so years. This idea couldn't have happened in 2017, 18, 19, but in the last 3 to 5 years, it can. There's this whole class of low code or no code. You would have heard those terms, technologies that have hit the markets, all open source, free and open source technologies, right? Open source software has really eaten the world. Open source software is the foundation of every single tech enterprise in the world. Zerodha is entirely built on free and open source software. So all the tech exists out there. Most technology that a social sector org would require, it exists out there. And there's this whole new class of technologies called no-code, low-code, where you don't need an army of programmers to take something and build stuff on top. You just need tech-savvy people who know how to tune those knobs. So those technologies now exist out there. That was one big part of the puzzle. That seems to have kind of solved itself. It's a big shift that's happened in the last 5 years. Then you need tech people offering tech services to the social sector. So the reality, again, is that if you pick Bangalore, for instance, there are tens of thousands of tech companies, really small shops, 2-person company, 5-person company, 10-person company, people with tech capacity to offer basic tech solutions. Let's say pick up some of these open source tools and configure it for a certain use case, for a certain org. But they don't know that the social sector even exists. That was really shocking to me. The entire tech services, small shop industry does not even know that this whole untouched world exists. So you need to build that bridge to bring them over. And they have financial incentives. It's a 2-person shop. They offer tech services. NGOs are willing to pay fair prices. So that was another big revelation, evidence-based that we figured from our experiments. And then there's the tech volunteering community. Tons and tons of young techies and engineers who come out every year, who are looking for projects, who are looking to learn. But unless you have really large structured programs, you can't bring them over because there's no guidance, there's nothing here. So we put all of these learnings together, and last year we started this experiment called Oasis. We did an Oasis summit in Bangalore. Some really large orgs came together to try and do this. So Oasis stands for Open Source Alliance for Social Innovation and Sustainability. And Oasis, the acronym, it's a great name. It was generated by ChatGPT. So, and the goal of this alliance, it's an alliance. It's a collective of orgs who've realized these problems, orgs who have varying capacities, some tech orgs, some large philanthropies, etc., is to try and attack this problem from all of these sides. Now, how do we do it? This is the big experiment. So these 3 pieces that I spoke about, you have to figure out ways to bring them together. Now that requires maybe funding a bunch of tech companies whose sole goal is to provide services to the tech sector and establish a model that shows that tech companies and techies can also make a reasonable living and that it's not fully charity. So these are the experiments that have to be tried, and these are the experiments we're trying. Ironically, again, what I've seen, the crazy thing is significant amount of budget that nonprofits get, and you know how difficult it is to raise funding for a small org, are spent on building technology. Oh, I want this donor management system, I want this CRM, I want this volunteering management system, and they get fleeced by vendors, and they lose tens of lakhs, 50-60% of their entire budgets on software projects that never get anywhere. So it's not that there's no money, it's just that 90% of the money is already wasted. But to solve problems with the right choice of the right kind of service providers, the right kind of existing free and open source technologies that you can adopt, stitching them together, it can be done at 1/10 the price without having an army of programmers. So there is some hope. I'm a pessimist in general. I'm a high-functioning pessimist, especially with climate change. But there is hope here, I think. And this hope has been built on a lot of experiments over the last 4+ years. And based on, so we're building that body of evidence. So it's a capacity problem. We just have to figure out ways to solve that capacity problem. It's not a tech problem. All the technology exists out there. You just need people who know what to use for what problems, how to bring them together.
I think the other thing that might be missing in the ecosystem in terms of this mapping or matching are the right set of people that can speak both languages.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So you've got a non-profit that is saying we want X, Y, and Z in terms of articulating their needs, but they're not speaking the language of the engineer or the coder. And similarly, the other side may say, yeah, of course, it's obvious, there are these 5 things available, but then they don't fully understand the context. And so there might be an opportunity also, and I don't know if Oasis does this, it sounds amazing.
It's a part of the plan for sure. You need people who speak both sides, because generally techies tend to have a very tech-first solution, like I used to have. Oh, there's a social problem, I immediately build this piece of software and solve that social problem. And even if somebody offers you a solution, how does a non-profit or a social sector org say yes to it. They don't have the understanding. So you need that whole layer, small group of people who can do this translation. And you don't need an army of people for this, because most or many social sector orgs have the same set of recurring problems, fundamentally. Knowledge management, data management, visualization, donor management, finance management, all kinds of things, right? And once you have some success stories, the rest can just be replicated very easily with this particular set of technologies. So that's why I'm hopeful. You don't need tens of thousands of people. You just need 100 people who do this with 500 dogs or 100 dogs, and then it can be replicated across.
I was thinking 10 people doing it with 5 orgs, but that's it's a
Over
different
10
number.
years.
Over 10 years. But it would be a really interesting pilot, right? I mean, to maybe say 15 folks doing it with 10 orgs, and maybe even building open source platforms, right? So,
Yeah.
for example, a fundraising platform, rather than somebody going off to Salesforce, somebody else going off to something else. Just find an integrated fundraising platform that a bunch of social sector orgs could use, and it's open source, and people can layer it on with particular needs or however it works. But I think that would be a huge value addition to the ecosystem.
100%. Shared resources. So I keep saying this, especially in the social sector, don't build, reuse. Because at some point you may be able to build once you have that capacity, but don't think about building, think about reusing.
And perhaps also the folks that start it off, right? Your early thought partners. I guess there has to be careful selection on both sides, right? Because then if you can demonstrate that this is feasible, this works out, and you have a couple of exemplars or case studies, then it's so much easier to scale those common solutions or those common platforms, right?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just head nodding to everything you're saying.
I'm head nodding to everything you are saying.
Violently
You're saying all the
agree.
right things.
I think we've talked about a bunch of things around, just the complexity of human problems, Zeroda's journey, your point of view on technology as a solution, how we can bring together and build capacity in social sector organizations. Given the learnings that you've also had, and perhaps climate is the one that's closest to your heart in terms of where you really want to bring, or at least make an effort to do things differently or to make some change happen. What is your wish for the world, or what is your wish for social entrepreneurs or social enterprises?
That's a very difficult question to answer. I don't have one wish. I think when I try to visualize an ideal outcome for the world, I'm always lost. It's like you said, humanity, it's such a complex system, right? Every single interaction has the potential to change the trajectory of history in good and bad ways. It is such a complex, absurd system. Every coincidence causes absurd ripples, right? I can't make sense of it. I don't have the ability to, I can say world peace, yes, let's have world peace, but I really don't have the ability to articulate like an ideal vision in the frame of how humanity or society or the world really works. But I just hope for good things and go with the flow. That's all I can think of.
Yeah, I think at some level you kind of take it one day or 1 week at a time, because there's only so much of forward planning you can do. But I guess fundamentally, and I would love your thoughts on this. I think sometimes fundamentally I reflect on the state of the world that we're in. And as a society, we have optimized for GDP for so long, right? And
one of the biggest mistakes in human history, I think, adopting GDP as the metric for growth. Yeah.
And you lose that holistic sense of what it means to be a human, right? Or what it means to build a society or a civilization, right? And but it's very difficult to anchor ourselves away from that. And it takes, and I'm a relentless optimist. So then I think about how do we make that happen, right? How do we anchor society away from that? Because is it enough with a few well-meaning people? How do you create enough of that momentum to then ripple the waves of thinking about growth or societal impact in a different manner. Because if you think about our education system, our health system, the folks that, everything is architected towards optimizing GDP or, money or whatever that might be. And you don't optimize for certain behavioral traits that are important for the future of humanity. So I talked about a bunch of things, but just curious about your views on that.
I think...
Okay, super.
That would be a very depressing thought. There are so many problems, and if we, as individuals, face these extremely large, impossible problems to solve, and many large problems really come down to simple solutions, which are basically human intent. Why are rivers polluted, or why do our cities have a garbage problem? Many of these have really simple solutions. Just be mindful, but it's impossible to pull off. So, but can one person create massive positive changes? Absolutely. I mean, throughout history, you've had individuals change the world, change the course of history for the better and worse. But can every person become such a big change maker? Possibly, you can't really know. You can only really know in hindsight. But if you set out with massive goals of changing the world, I think the probability of being disappointed and dejected and jaded is really high, because there are infinite problems to solve. But if you accept that the world is really messed up, and acceptance is the first step, and the world is an extremely absurd, chaotic system, and you do whatever is in your capacity to do, even if it's one tiny positive change, and you just hope that maybe the butterfly effect will, scale it, then I think life becomes a lot more bearable. So you do whatever little you can, and at some point it might scale, it might not scale, but you don't really have to hope for scale every single day. That the probability of that is low. But if you keep doing good things, more good things may happen. So that is my worldview. That's what keeps me going, despite being a relentless pessimist, unlike you.
So how do you live that worldview on a day-to-day basis? What you just described.
I think I've been lucky in that sense. I think every day I wake up and I'm excited to do something new, create something, create a small little change. It could be technology stuff, it could be a small little tech solution, it could be something else. But every day I wake up and I have that urge and spirit, despite knowing that the world is doomed, despite knowing that we are facing a planetary crisis and there's no going back from climate change, and we are ruining the planet by the day. But in the face of that, I set all of that aside, and I have that excitement to do that one small little thing. So that's what keeps me going, and I guess I'm lucky that I have that one thing. So I really worry. I worry for health, my own health, and friends and family and whatnot. But I worry that one day I'll wake up and I won't have this spirit. That would be extremely dreadful. So that's what keeps me going.
When you lose that spirit, then call a bunch of people who are at Chacha, so that you get that dose of energy back. So lots of really interesting questions. Maybe I'll take a couple. One is for sectors where there is very little information and data available, like gender, how do you see technology supporting efforts in those thematic areas?
I don't think it should be looked at from a top-down perspective. You have this really big issue, let's say, surrounding gender, and I don't think it should be looked at this lens where you try and bring technology into generate insights. This is Robin Hood Army First Principles example is a great example. It was a large enterprise, volunteering enterprise, and it was solving a problem, but there were no insights. And then we built this small little tool, and suddenly all the insights became available. So I think it will come through that as small little ancillary tech aid to existing social work that will bring insights, but not from, if we try to bring in insights and generate data by using technology on such a precarious, such a complex problem, I don't think it'll work. So complement existing work in the area with small little bits of technology to aid.
Got it. On the first principles approach and also
Yeah,
what you
yeah.
discussed here, there's a question around, there is a school of scale thought that is of the view that solutions should be defined and designed for scale from the get-go. Right from the time that you start thinking about the solution, you start planning for scale, as opposed to building up, which is your first principles approach. What's your view on that? Because that contrasts with the first principles approach that you've been talking about.
They're not mutually exclusive. You should have sight of eventualities. Even if you can't predict the future, you should try and take informed guesses. And first principles, the first principles way of solving a problem, it's an approach, it's a perspective, it's a way of executing small little things, but towards a much larger goal. So they're not mutually exclusive. But if you have a myopic vision, maybe that I want to solve this, I want to solve it big on day one, I think that's generally the scale approach, at least what I see in the industry, that is likely to fail. So scale and first principles are very, very mutually inclusive. You just have to have that insight, set that aside, be realistic about it, and do whatever is necessary to get there. But if you don't have first principles right, the probability of scaling anything is naturally low.
Yeah. And when organizations think about digital solutions or digital enablers, and you talked about some of them being open source and available, what are some of the risks that nonprofits should keep in mind when they think about open source digital solutions?
I think there are no risks that are specific to open source technology. In fact, if you adopt an open source piece of technology as opposed to a proprietary vendor locked-in system, you're already much safer. But there are technical risks, there are cyber security risks, nothing to do with open source in general, it's to do with tech adoption as a whole. So that every org has to be aware of, but then again, there's no capacity to be aware of, and that's the capacity we hope that will be built.
One of your suggestions, don't build, reuse. What do you think about sharing not just tech platforms, but also resources and capacities across social sector organizations? So, the tech talent, I think I completely resonate with that. You don't have enough critical mass if you hire an engineer or a fantastic programmer. You just don't have critical mass for that talent, right? And so they're just going to just run out of peers that they can talk to. So I guess the question relates to how do you perhaps think about shared resources for the sector? And I think Oasis is probably doing something along those lines.
I think this is being tried out by a bunch of people. I can cite Lobo's work at Tech for Dev, where they've built this program called the fractional CTO. And apparently it's working really well. You have a CTO and they're fractional to an org. So you'll have one CTO consulting for 10 different social sector orgs. And because this is built out specifically for the social sector, they have the right perspective, they have the right view. And the last time I spoke to him, it's working out really well. And that's a great experiment. Maybe this model will start scaling, fractional CTOs. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I didn't know he was doing that. And also, it's somebody that can speak the language, on both sides.
Yeah,
it's also a way to bring that person.
Yeah.
And then share learnings across social sector organizations.
Yeah.
There's a question here around how should we think about, the communities that we often work with are extremely vulnerable communities, low income, first generation learners may not have even, may not be able to send their children to school. So when we think about technology, how are we thinking about communities? Are we thinking enough about communities is, I guess, the question.
This is why a first principles view, especially in this sector, is so important. We can sit here and maybe come up with a great app idea that let's say every migrant laborer can install on their phone and operate to avail services. But what about smartphones then? What about digital literacy then? What about all these other aspects, right? So I think that layer of technology between the most vulnerable communities and somebody who's trying to solve problems should be as thin as possible. That's why I like Robin Hood's approach of using WhatsApp. They didn't go out and build an app on day one. They just had WhatsApp, and everybody kind of knows how to use WhatsApp. And there are other orgs who have Rebenefit, for instance, has again WhatsApp as an interface to their volunteering interface in their volunteering communities. And I've seen orgs who accept voice messages. Gramvani is a great example. So you can leave a voice note in your language on WhatsApp, just a small little sound recording, and that gets translated in the backend, etc., etc. But the interface is so simple, it's so low touch, it's such a thin layer. Nobody has to download an app, install OTP, etc., etc. So it's important, especially with communities, to make the technology layer, if at all one is required, as thin and as accessible as possible. So you really have to be human first there than tech first.
And to what extent do you, so a lot of this comes from, I think, all of the thing that you were describing about starting with the problem first and then solving for it. And again, using the first principles approach to make sure that it's a thin layer. But how do you anticipate, or do you anticipate the needs of the community as you're planning out a program, or even for Zerodha as you're planning out the platform? You know, just to what extent do you have to also anticipate what the community might need in the future, given how the world is changing?
I think that's extremely important, not just in the social sector, anywhere. And I think in the industry, when it comes to businesses, that is what really makes or breaks companies. We, for instance, at Zerodha, we have certain vision, we have certain philosophies, and we have a way of solving problems. Everybody tries to build their project or technology or business in their own image. But what if it is fundamentally incompatible with what the people really want, or how it really works in the real world, right? So there you have to do the field work, be fully open-minded, to truly understand what your end user, the human, require. And the surprising thing is, most often you have these great brainwaves, innovation, oh, we can build this, we can release this. Then you realize nobody really wants it, so don't bother building. So doing that homework of putting the end user, the human, in the center, and then working upwards than us doing arbitrary decisions is extremely important. But sometimes you simply can't know and you take a bet. But there you optimize for being least wrong. It's very difficult to be always right, but being least wrong and reducing damage is the way to go. So your idea of a solution for a problem here, and what people really need or can handle on the other hand, with a lot of weightage, extra weightage given to the latter. That's how we build technology and products at Zerodha. And that's how it should be. It's common sense. It's not a secret sauce. That's how it should be done everywhere.
And I guess there's a strong layer of judgment and experience that comes in when you have to anticipate what the customer may need, or if there is a gap that is missing, which you could then use the product to fill, which may not be immediately visible. Yeah,
that comes from experience, domain expertise, domain knowledge, understanding the psychology of your end users. I mean, in the startup world, you have examples of people trying to build all kinds of things that they have no clue about. You know, this notion that, oh, I can launch an app, I can build an app and solve that real world problem, but with absolutely no understanding of the real world problem. I mean, the startup world is a graveyard of such dead products and startups.
So I think we're coming to the end of time. You know, you talked about reap benefit, and one of the things that they've been doing is to maybe, I guess it's almost decentralized change efforts, you know, by actually going to, by empowering everyone to kind of be the change, you know, and to kind of almost build, and many organizations do this kind of from a grassroots perspective, right? I don't know if it's grassroots, but it's actually empowering and helping everybody realize that they can be part of the change. But then you need some structures in place to be able to then make something of that individual recognition. So I would love to hear, what are your views of this kind of distributed change efforts, perhaps, right? That distributed leadership in terms of how we make our future.
I think so. Distribution, decentralization, federation. These concepts, these principles, these are all words we use in the tech world, but these are all words, exact same words and principles that we apply in the meat space, as we call it, in the human realm, right? Any complex system, the more centralized it is, the more prone it is to failure in many ways. Catastrophic technical failures, catastrophic governance failures, and we've seen what centralization of power does to humans in the human realm, right? So the principles of distributability and decentralization underlie absolutely everything. Anything that has to sustain. Just looking at simple odds and probability, something that is decentralized is much harder to destroy than something that is super centralized, like your power grid, for instance. So when I think of problems and solution, I think I have a very decentralization or distribution first view to it. When we architect technology systems, let's say within Zerodha or elsewhere, the first thing that we think of is how do we distribute risk, load, traffic, etc. So distribution, the word, decentralization is absolutely baked in. Zerodha is a centralized institution, one of the many in the stock market. But thankfully, because we have many, that risk is distributed amongst competition. But imagine if there was only one stockbroker, right? But even within a centralized Zerodha that many users use, the technology systems underneath it, the way we've structured our teams, the way we've structured our decisions, etc., is as decentralized and independent as possible, with a thin layer of centralization, so that we are as less wrong as possible.
I think it's an interesting question also because, when we think about scale in India, perhaps, that's loud.
That's very loud.
In red also, those you can't see, shining times up in red. I guess in India, when you have government, that's where the scale comes from. And so when you decentralize, you have to, you're facing that daily or, that consistent challenge of you can decentralize, but yet how do you maintain consistency and, that adherence to a certain, perhaps, I guess I'm using the example of education. How do you decentralize to the teacher so that they are the agent of change and they're creating the best possible classroom so the children can learn? But how do you do that in a way that's uniform so that your entire system at scale can deliver a much better set of learning or helping every child achieve their potential? I think that's what I probably come up against.
No, absolutely. I think, and that's one of the most fundamental problems of the human civilization, figuring out the right balance between all these systems, centralization, federated, decentralized, etc. And it's only in the last century or so that we've seen massive globalization in the way it is, where you have a lot of decentralized systems, economies, states, etc., which all kind of work globally. It's very interesting. It's one of the biggest challenges. I think it'll take centuries for humanity to really understand and nail this, if not more, if not thousands of years.
So I guess my last question, if you were not playing your current role at Zerodha, what would you be doing?
I'd still be tinkering. I've always been a tinkerer. I really like technology. I'd be playing with open source technologies, building open source technologies that solve small little problems and releasing them. I'd always be tinkering. I don't have an alternate vision for myself. I've always been a tinkerer.
Thank you so much for coming. And I know it's been a trek from Bangalore. So I think everyone really enjoyed talking to you and just hearing much more about it.
It was a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I invite the volunteers to facilitate the speakers. And I think, Kruti, while you declared that we had consciously chosen, because there is no charcha with two digital natives on the dais. You should always have a conversation with otherwise. So it was a conscious choice. And I think Nitin has been our go-to people for the one tech person whom I've heard, who speaks a lot with the heart. And I think one of the boot camp, he said, there is a thin line between passion and craziness, and that's called success. and that stood with us. And I think we will take back great things. Simplicity scales. Tech layer being thin, I think one of the challenges that every time that happens is that we don't see WhatsApp as technology because sab log karte hain. Like you don't feel that if when it's very obvious, it is good enough, right? You have to have something very complicated, I think, there. And first principles, after a point, I counted it was 16 times. That's the pleasure that we'll have to be doing. And yes, yes. And attracting tech personnel to the social sector, I think that's one space we've been thinking. So the entire social sector starts to grow so that the tech person, the socially conscious tech person doesn't feel alienated. We never thought of it that way. We never thought of it that they will be terribly alienated here because there is nobody to talk to the tech language. And I understand where you're coming, because after a point, just being a mother of 8-year-old or 9-year-old, for me, tinkering is just messy, right? Like, so language becomes very important. I think amazing, amazing things. Building bridge between the tech and the social sector organization. OYAS's, I think, tech volunteering community, we're all there. The entire social entrepreneurship crowd is going to be there. Great talk, thought-inspiring, as always, Kailash. So just felicitation, please. And a great round. If not tinkering, I always thought he would make a great guru. Just go and see the YouTube video of IIT Bangalore. And I was like, is he the tech person or is he a good run for a spiritual guru? It was there. So please. Yes. It is a compliment. So thank you so much. Take your time. Just go back and give us the feedback in the form. And there is an amazing performance lined up for you today. Don't miss it. It is Rajasthani folk with Sufi maestro Kutle Khan and his band at Stein.